I still remember the first time I saw her standing in the hallway with her arms full of grocery bags, struggling with her keys, her hair messy in a way that made her look both harmless and approachable. I had just moved into the building a few months earlier, still adjusting to the thin walls and the creaky elevator that always seemed to break down at the worst times. My apartment wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had carved out a little corner of the city for myself. That day she smiled at me, as if we had known each other for years. Her name was Clara. She told me she lived 2 doors down and that she'd been in the building much longer than me. There was something warm in her voice that made me lower my guard. I even offered to hold one of her bags, and when she laughed and said, "You're a lifesaver," I felt like I had just made a friend in a place that often felt so lonely. At first, our encounters were small things. She'd knock on my door to borrow sugar, or I'd run into her in the lobby when we were both waiting for the mail. She always had a story to share, about a difficult co-worker, about her cat who kept scratching the furniture, about how expensive everything in the neighbourhood had gotten. I would listen, nod, and sometimes even invite her in for coffee. My apartment became our little meeting spot, cluttered with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the hum of my old radio playing in the background. It felt nice. I was in my late 20s, single and working long hours, so having someone drop by with no expectations felt like comfort. Slowly, she became part of my routine. She knew what days I worked late. She knew the name of my landlord. She even knew where I kept the spare key in case of emergencies. Looking back now, I can see how dangerous that was. How much I gave away without realizing it, but at the time it just felt like trust. I grew up in a small town where neighbors looked after each other, where you could leave your door unlocked and someone would water your plants when you were gone. I wanted to believe that city life could still hold a bit of that, and Clara seemed to bring that feeling back. She was always flattering me too. She said I had a talent for decorating, that my apartment felt so alive. Unlike hers, which she called dull and uninspired. She admired my bookshelves, the way I had fairy lights strung above the couch, the plant corner I carefully tended to. I thought she was just being kind, but sometimes her compliments lingered too long, like she was memorizing every detail of my home. I remember one night in particular. I had cooked a simple pasta dinner and invited her over. We sat cross-legged on my rug, laughing, eating off mismatched plates. She said, "You're so lucky to live here. This is the best unit in the building. I've always wanted one with a balcony." I shrugged it off, told her it was pure luck that I got it, because someone had broken their lease just before I moved in. She looked around with eyes that seemed to weigh every corner, every piece of furniture. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I thought she was just admiring. Now I know she was taking inventory. Clara's presence in my life grew so gradually that I barely noticed how often she was around. She would drop by after work with a bottle of cheap wine or bring leftovers from her kitchen. Sometimes she even came by just to sit in silence while I typed away on my laptop. At first it felt comforting to have someone who didn't expect anything dramatic from me, just company. But slowly I realised she was studying me, learning my habits in ways I didn't fully register. She knew what time I usually got home, which nights I liked to stay in, even when I took my long showers before bed. There were moments that should have raised alarms, like when she casually asked about my rent, who my landlord was, whether the lease was strict about guests. I laughed and brushed it off because I thought she was just making conversation. But the questions had a sharper edge I didn't see back then. One night she even said, "If I were you, I'd never give this place up. It's a dream in this city." And I nodded, not realising how much those words revealed about her thoughts. My apartment wasn't luxurious, but it was homey. The little balcony overlooked a narrow street lined with old maple trees. In the fall, the leaves turned the whole block golden, People would stop and take pictures. It was the kind of charm that made you forget the cracked tiles in the bathroom or the buzzing fridge. I often sat out there with coffee in the morning, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the city wake up. Sometimes Clara joined me, leaning on the railing, asking what I paid for rent, pressing again as if the number mattered more than my company. I tried to ignore the slight unease because I was lonely, and loneliness has a way of dulling instincts. When you crave connection, you excuse small red flags. You convince yourself people are just curious or quirky. So I opened my door wider and let her inside more often. She started helping herself to my kitchen, rearranging my mugs, even telling me which plants needed trimming. I told myself it was just her way of being helpful, and in return I started confiding in her. I told her about my stressful job, about how my boss never gave me credit, about my ex who still sent confusing texts late at night. Clara always listened with sympathetic eyes, nodding at the right moments, saying things like, "You deserve better, you deserve peace." It felt good, like finally I wasn't invisible. But the more I shared, the more she seemed to tighten her hold. She remembered every detail, repeating my own words back to me in ways that made me feel both understood and strangely exposed. There was one evening when the power went out of the building. The hallways were dark and eerie. I lit candles and she came over with a flashlight. We sat together on the floor eating crackers and cheese, laughing about how it felt like camping. But then she looked around my candlelit apartment and whispered, "This place feels like it belongs to me." She said it half joking, but something in her tone made my skin prickle. I laughed nervously, choosing to hear it as flattery, though deep down, a small voice told me it wasn't a joke at all. The first real crack in our friendship appeared so quietly that at the time I barely registered it. She had started to come over, even when I hadn't invited her, knocking gently and saying she just happened to be passing by, but somehow always arriving right when I had settled in with dinner or after a long day when all I wanted was quiet. At first I still welcomed her because I didn't want to seem rude, but gradually I noticed she wasn't coming for me. She was coming for the apartment itself. Her eyes lingered too long on the framed photos on the shelf, on the way the afternoon light poured across the living room. Once she even measured with her hands the size of the balcony as though memorizing it. When I teased her about wanting to redecorate, she smiled and said, "Maybe someday." Another time she brought over a bottle of wine and insisted we sit out on the balcony. She leaned back in the chair, exhaling like she owned the air itself, then turned to me and asked, "Don't you ever worry you'll lose this place?" The question startled me. I told her I paid my rent on time and had no reason to worry, but she just smirked and said, "Still, things happen." Her words stayed with me all night like a splinter under the skin, but I pushed it away, telling myself I was being dramatic. Soon, Clara began weaving herself deeper into my life in ways I didn't fully consent to. She started picking up my packages from the lobby before I even got home, dropping them off at my door with a too bright smile. She collected my mail if I worked late. Once she even slipped inside when I was showering because I had left the door unlocked. She claimed she only wanted to leave groceries she bought for us, but I couldn't shake the image of her walking through my apartment when I was unaware. I tried to set small boundaries, saying I like to have my evenings alone sometimes, but she brushed it off, saying, "We're neighbours, it's natural," and guilt made me let it slide. After all, I had always been taught to be polite, to avoid conflict, yet her presence grew heavier each week, like ivy crawling up walls until it covers every window. I noticed she started asking oddly specific questions, like when my lease was up, whether my landlord ever checked the apartment, and if I had family nearby. I laughed nervously, but didn't answer directly, telling myself she was just curious because she was lonely too. Still, her interest felt invasive. One afternoon, I came home early from work and found her sitting on the stairs outside my door as if she had been waiting. She said she had locked herself out and wanted to keep me company until the locksmith came. But later I found out she hadn't lost her keys at all. The story had been an excuse to linger near my apartment, close enough to breathe in its air like it already belonged to her. Looking back, that was the first time I truly felt fear bloom beneath the surface of my trust. A quiet realization that perhaps her friendship wasn't friendship at all, but something else entirely. The more I think about it now, the more I realize how subtle her game really was. Clara never demanded anything outright. She slipped herself into my life so gently that by the time I noticed, it felt almost impossible to push her away. She began leaving little things in my apartment, as if marking territory. A scarf draped over the back of my chair, a pair of slippers by the door, even a mug she insisted was hers. I told myself it was harmless, but every object seemed to whisper a warning. Her presence was expanding beyond casual visits, turning my home into something we were supposedly sharing. One Saturday morning, I woke up to find her on my balcony watering my plants. She had climbed over from her own unit without asking, smiling like it was the most natural thing. My heart raced with anger, but when I confronted her, she just laughed and said, "You should thank me. I'm saving them." And I swallowed my frustration because I didn't want to start a fight. Though deep inside, a knot of unease tightened. She had this way of twisting my politeness against me. Every time I tried to say no, she'd look wounded, like I was the cruel one. Once I told her I didn't feel comfortable with her checking my mail, and she replied, "I'm just trying to help you. You work so hard." And the guilt hit me so hard that I let her continue. But her help never felt like help. It felt like surveillance. Around that time, she started to know things she shouldn't. She'd mention my landlord's schedule, or how the downstairs neighbour had missed rent. Details I never told her. One evening she said almost casually, "Your lease renewal should be coming up soon, right?" And when I asked how she knew, she just shrugged. My stomach twisted, but I laughed it off because confronting her felt impossible. I grew up in a household where keeping peace was more important than speaking truth. And Clara somehow sensed that weakness in me. She used it like a tool. There was one night I'll never forget. I came home exhausted, dropped my bag by the door, and nearly screamed when I saw her sitting on my couch in the dark. She said she'd heard a strange noise and wanted to make sure I was safe. She had used the spare key I once trusted her with. My body went cold, but I forced a smile because fear and politeness tangled inside me. I told her gently not to do that again, but deep down I knew something had shifted. My home no longer felt like mine alone. After that, I started hiding the spare key in a new place, but the damage was done. She had crossed the invisible line between neighbourly concern and intrusion. Yet she carried herself with such calm confidence that part of me wondered if I was overreacting. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe she really did just care. But then she began making comments about how unfair it was that I had this apartment. How someone like her deserved a chance to live in a place with light and space. She'd sigh dramatically and say, "If only I could start over here." Her words slid into my ears like poison and stayed there, echoing at night when I tried to sleep. That was when I started locking my door more carefully, double-checking windows, but still I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow she was already inside, waiting for her chance. I started noticing how Clara's mood changed whenever anyone else came over. A co-worker dropped by once to return a book, and she appeared minutes later with some excuse about borrowing milk, her eyes scanning my living room, like she was checking whether the space still felt like hers. When my sister visited from out of town, Clara suddenly insisted on baking cookies in her apartment and bringing them over, sitting uninvited and steering every conversation back to life in the building. My sister later whispered, "That woman is strange. Watch yourself." But I brushed it off, though the warning stuck with me. Clara had a way of making me doubt my own instincts. If I pulled back, she'd shower me with attention, showing up with small gifts or offering to run errands. If I let her closer, she'd push boundaries further, leaving her things behind or dropping hints about how expensive rent was getting. One evening, I caught her staring at my lease papers on the counter. She smiled and said she was just curious about how official they looked. I laughed nervously and tucked them away, but inside my chest, a wave of alarm pulsed. Around that time, my landlord mentioned in passing that someone had asked about my unit, whether it might be available soon. I didn't think much of it until later, when I remembered Clara's endless questions, her constant comments about how perfect my apartment was. The realization crept in slowly like a shadow stretching across the floor, and once it was there, I couldn't unsee it. Clara wasn't just a lonely neighbour. She wanted what I had. She wanted my apartment. The scariest part was how patient she seemed, never rushing, just waiting for cracks to appear, planting seeds of doubt in me about whether I could keep up with bills, suggesting I might be happier moving somewhere quieter, somewhere smaller, all wrapped in concern, as if she was only thinking of me. But I could hear the hunger in her voice, like every word was sharpened with envy. I remember sitting on the balcony one night after she left, staring at the lights of the city and realizing I no longer felt safe in my own home. The place that once felt like a sanctuary now felt invaded, as if her presence had soaked into the walls, into the air I breathed. I promised myself I'd be more careful, but part of me already knew it was too late. She had gotten too close, and stepping back would not be simple. The turning point came the week I got sick. It was just the flu, but it knocked me out hard. I stayed home from work with tissues piled on the nightstand and tea always steeping in the kitchen. Clara saw my weakness like blood in the water. She showed up constantly with soup or medicine, but also with questions that didn't feel like kindness. She asked where I kept my important documents in case I needed help. She offered to pay my rent for the month if I couldn't get out of bed. Her voice sweet, but her eyes too sharp. I declined politely, but the fact that she asked made me shiver. She spent hours in my apartment those days, sometimes tidying things I hadn't asked her to touch. I woke up once from a fever nap to find her rearranging my closet. She said she was looking for extra blankets. I forced a smile, but deep down a cold fear spread through me. The thought that she was mapping out my life while I lay helpless. When I finally recovered and tried to take back my space, I noticed subtle changes. Drawers slightly out of place. A set of spare keys I kept in a box had vanished, then reappeared a day later. I couldn't prove anything, but I knew. Clara's behaviour grew bolder after that. She made comments about how pale I looked, how maybe the apartment was too much for me, how I might be happier somewhere easier. It was dressed up as concern, but the intent was obvious. She was planting the idea that I should leave. My landlord stopped me one afternoon in the hallway and said Clara had asked again if I was planning to renew my lease. I laughed it off, pretending not to care, but inside I burned with panic. She wasn't just circling anymore, she was making moves. I started locking everything, double-checking the door each night, but I still felt her in my space, as though my walls could no longer keep her out, and I hated myself for ever handing her the spare key, for ever believing her friendship was real. I lay awake at night listening for footsteps in the hallway, wondering if the next time I came home, she'd already be inside waiting. Not as a guest, but as if she owned the place. I tried to create distance, telling Clara I was overwhelmed at work and needed more alone time, but she had this way of treating my boundaries like invitations to push harder. She'd knock at odd hours with excuses that seemed flimsy, once saying she'd lost her Wi-Fi and needed to use mine, another time claiming she'd run out of sugar, though I'd just seen her return from the store with bags full of groceries. It wasn't about needing anything. It was about reminding me she could appear whenever she wanted. My chest tightened each time I heard her footsteps in the hallway, as if the sound itself had become a warning. I started noticing other changes too. Subtle things that told me she was pulling strings behind my back. Neighbours would mention how friendly Clara was, how she always talked about me, sometimes in ways that made me sound careless. One woman even said Clara had told her I was thinking about moving, which wasn't true at all. I realised she was building a story where she'd step in naturally if I ever left. The worst moment came when I got a call from my landlord saying Clara had approached him directly about taking over my unit if I ever moved out. He laughed it off with me, saying she seemed very interested, but the chill that ran through me was impossible to hide. I felt betrayed, invaded, as though my home was being negotiated over my head. That night I confronted her, my voice shaking as I asked why she'd talked to my landlord. She didn't even deny it. Instead, she tilted her head and said, "I just love your place. Can you blame me?" Her smile was calm, too calm, like she was daring me to call her out. I wanted to scream, to throw her out of my life completely, but the words stuck in my throat because fear mixed with guilt. Part of me still clung to the idea that maybe she was lonely. Maybe I was imagining the malice in her tone, yet deep down I knew better. I began locking my balcony door, something I had never done before, because I no longer trusted she wouldn't climb over. I even thought about getting a camera, but worried she'd notice and escalate. Every move I made felt like playing defense in a game I hadn't chosen. My once cozy sanctuary felt tense, every corner carrying the weight of her presence. I caught myself wondering what she was doing in her own apartment, whether she was planning her next move, rehearsing the life she wanted to steal. After that confrontation, something in Clara shifted. She stopped pretending to be subtle. Her visits became more abrupt, like she was testing how far she could go. One evening, I came home and found her leaning against my door frame, holding my Amazon package. She said she had picked it up for me, but when I reached for it, she didn't let go right away. Just stared at me with a strange little smile, before finally handing it over. It felt like a warning disguised as kindness. I started keeping a mental log of everything she did. The times she knocked, the things she asked, the way she lingered in the hallway. Because part of me felt I'd need proof one day, that this wasn't just paranoia, that she really was trying to push me out. Then came the night I heard her talking through the wall. Our bedrooms were adjacent, and when the building was quiet, I could sometimes catch her phone calls. This time I heard her say my name, followed by, "When she moves out, I'll take it." My stomach clenched, and I sat frozen in bed, realizing she was already speaking of my home as if it was hers. My hands shook as I clutched the blanket. I wanted to bang on the wall and scream, but instead I lay awake until dawn, too afraid of what would come next. Days later, I discovered she had somehow charmed the landlord's assistant, who let slip that Clara had been asking detailed questions about my lease dates. I felt exposed, like all my personal information was slipping into her hands. She was weaving a net, and I was caught inside it. My friends told me to cut her off completely, to stop answering the door, but living 2 units away made avoidance almost impossible. She was always there, always watching, even when I pretended not to see. Once I came home and found a note slipped under my door that read, "You deserve somewhere new. Let me help you." In her handwriting, no explanation, no apology, Just the message staring up at me from the floor like a threat disguised as care. I crumpled it and threw it out, but the words stayed etched in my mind. That night I locked every bolt and chain, sitting in the dark with my heart pounding, realizing my life had narrowed into a battle over four walls. That my neighbour wasn't just a neighbour anymore, but someone determined to replace me. Someone willing to blur the line between friendship and theft until I couldn't tell where my safety ended and her desire began. The pressure only grew after that. Clara started acting like my life was something she could rewrite. She'd comment on how tired I looked, how stressed I seemed, then casually slip in lines about how moving somewhere smaller would ease the burden. It was always the same script. Concern wrapped around poison. She even began telling neighbours that I was planning to leave, planting this rumour so often that people asked me where I was moving. I laughed it off, but inside my chest burned. She was shaping a story of my absence before I'd even considered it. One night I returned home to find my door unlocked. My stomach dropped because I knew I had locked it. Nothing was missing, but things were shifted. A chair angled differently, a drawer not closed all the way. The air itself felt disturbed, as if she had been there and left just moments before. I sat on my couch shaking, realising my sanctuary had been breached. I called the landlord the next morning and demanded new locks, pretending it was just for safety in the building, but I could hear hesitation in his voice. Almost as if Clara had already been whispering in his ear. She was everywhere, slipping through cracks I didn't even know existed. My sleep turned restless. I'd jolt awake at every creak of the hallway, sometimes swearing I heard her footsteps pausing outside my door, my dreams blurred with reality, until I didn't know if I was imagining her shadow under the doorframe or if she was really there. Then came the letter, folded neatly and left in my mailbox with no stamp. Inside was a message written in neat handwriting that read, "This place is wasted on you. I'd take better care of it." My hands trembled as I read it over and over, my fear boiling into rage. The audacity of claiming what was mine as if I didn't deserve it. As if my life could be swapped for hers. I considered going to the police, but what would I even say? That my neighbour wanted my apartment, that she left me creepy notes. They would shrug it off until something tangible happened, and by then it might be too late. I felt cornered, trapped in a game where she made all the moves while I tried to hold on. But the walls of my home felt thinner each day. My breath shorter, my resolve cracking. I started to wonder if she'd ever stop, or if she would keep pressing until one of us finally broke. I reached a point where I couldn't live in denial anymore. Clara wasn't just an annoying neighbour with boundary issues. She had become a threat, a constant shadow that made every day feel like a battle to keep hold of my own life. I began documenting everything. The time she knocked, the notes she left, even the way she looked at my apartment when she thought I wasn't watching. I filled pages in a notebook with details, convincing myself that if anything happened, I'd have proof. But deep down, I wondered if proof would matter, because obsession doesn't leave fingerprints. It seeps into air and silence, into the way you feel when you step through your own door. Around that time, I decided to confront her directly one last time. I knocked on her door with my heart pounding, and when she opened it, I told her calmly but firmly that she needed to stop interfering in my life, that my apartment wasn't up for grabs, that her behaviour had crossed too many lines. She just stood there smiling, tilting her head like a child caught in a lie. And then she said something I'll never forget. "You can't hold on forever. Places like that should belong to someone who truly appreciates them." I felt my stomach drop. The way she said it wasn't angry or loud. It was certain, as if my fate was already sealed. That night I barely slept. Every creak in the building made me jump. I sat in the dark, listening for her footsteps, my body tense until dawn. When I looked around my apartment, the sunlight felt weaker. as though she had already stolen part of it. Days later, I learnt she had spoken to the landlord again, this time claiming I was unreliable, that I might be breaking the lease soon. He mentioned it offhand during a phone call, not realising how much it shook me. I realised she was poisoning the well, trying to build a case against me long before I even knew it, turning trust into suspicion with every carefully placed word. I felt trapped in a nightmare where my own voice carried no weight, where the story of my life was being rewritten by someone who wanted to replace me. It made me paranoid. I double-checked locks, pushed furniture against the door, kept lights on at night, still convinced that at any moment she might slip inside again. One evening, I caught her staring through my window from her balcony. No attempt to hide, just watching me as I moved around my living room. I closed the curtains with shaking hands and sat down, realising I wasn't living anymore. I was surviving, holding onto walls that no longer felt solid. Something inside me snapped that night, a quiet decision forming in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't keep waiting for her to take everything from me. I needed to act, to reclaim the space that was mine before her obsession suffocated me completely, and for the first time I let myself imagine fighting back. I realised that if I didn't take control, Clara would never stop. She had already crossed every line of decency and was now trying to rewrite my life as if it were her own. So I decided to fight her with the only weapon I had left: preparation. I started by moving my spare documents and valuables to a friend's place. I told no one because I didn't want Clara to sense any change. I bought a small camera disguised as a clock and placed it on my shelf facing the door, just in case she ever tried to sneak in again. My hands trembled as I set it up. The thought of capturing her intrusion both terrified and comforted me. At least I would no longer be powerless. I also spoke quietly with my landlord, laying out my concerns without sounding hysterical. I told him that Clara had been prying into my lease, that she was harassing me, and I asked him directly not to discuss my unit with her. He seemed startled and promised to respect my privacy, though I could see doubt flicker across his face. Clara had worked hard to present herself as harmless and kind, while I looked like the paranoid tenant. Still, I felt a shift, like maybe I had planted a seed of caution in his mind. Meanwhile, Clara grew bolder. One evening, I found her standing in the hallway talking to another neighbour, loudly saying how unfair it was that I had the best apartment when I barely appreciated it. I walked past pretending not to hear, but my skin burned. She wanted me humiliated, cornered, pushed into leaving by pressure rather than force. That was when I started to plan something I never thought I was capable of. Revenge, not violent but precise. I collected every note she had left, every message. I even wrote down the night I heard her through the wall. Then I drafted a letter to the landlord describing her harassment in detail, attaching the evidence. But before sending it, I hesitated, because part of me wanted her to know. I wanted her to feel the fear she had fed me for months. So instead I slipped a copy of one of her notes under her own door, with a short message in my handwriting. I keep everything. It was petty, maybe, but the silence that followed in the hallway the next day was worth it. For the first time she avoided my eyes. Yet even then I knew it wasn't over. People like Clara don't just stop. They wait, they regroup, and I could sense her simmering behind those walls, still calculating, still dreaming of my balcony and my light, and I braced myself because the final clash between us was coming, and it would decide whether I kept my home or lost it to the woman who had pretended to be my friend. The final straw came one rainy Thursday when I returned from work and found the door to my apartment slightly ajar. My heart stopped. I knew I had locked it. I pushed it open slowly, and the sight of Clara standing in my living room froze me in place. She wasn't holding groceries or wine this time. She was holding nothing at all, just standing there looking around like she was already at home. When she saw me, she didn't flinch. She just smiled faintly and said, "I was checking on things." As if that explained breaking into my space. Something inside me snapped. Months of fear and politeness burned away in a rush of fury. I told her to get out immediately, my voice louder than I had ever dared to use. She hesitated for a second, but the anger in my eyes must have startled her because she left without another word. The sound of her door slamming echoed down the hall. My hands shook as I locked everything. And then I went straight to my laptop. I pulled up the footage from the hidden camera and there it was. Clara letting herself in, wandering through my apartment like it was hers, touching the bookshelves, sitting on my couch, staring out my balcony door. I watched with tears streaming down my face. Equal parts rage and relief, because finally I had proof, tangible evidence that I wasn't crazy. That she really had been trying to steal not just my apartment, but my peace. The next morning, I marched to my landlord's office with the footage and my collected notes. I laid it all out and watched his expression shift from disbelief to horror. He promised immediate action. Locks would be changed. Clara would receive a warning. And if she didn't stop, she would be removed from the building. For the first time in months, I felt a crack of light breaking through the suffocating fog she had wrapped around me. Clara tried to approach me later, knocking softly as if nothing had happened. But I didn't open the door. I didn't need her words anymore. I had reclaimed my silence, my home, my story. Weeks passed and her presence shrank. She no longer lingered in the hallway. No more notes slipped under my door. Eventually I heard she was looking for another place. Maybe she realised the fight was over. Maybe she simply grew tired of losing. Sitting on my balcony one evening, the city glowing beneath me, I felt the weight of it all finally lift. My apartment felt like mine again. Not because of walls or rent, but because I had defended it, because I had refused to be erased. If there's anything I've learned, it's that kindness without boundaries is dangerous. I wanted so badly to believe in friendship that I ignored the signs of invasion. But now I know better. I know that protecting your space is not cruelty. It's survival. Clara thought she could steal my home by pretending to care, but in the end, all she did was remind me how much strength I carry, and how far I'll go to protect the life I've built, no matter who tries to take it.